All black, everything. Everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today in studio by Professor R. LaRue Lewis-McCoy, Associate Professor of Sociology and Black Studies at the City College in New York. He's the author of the just published book, Inequality in the Promised Land, Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling, just published by Stanford University Press, 2014. Affectionately known to his friends and his colleagues as Doomy.
Absolutely.
What's up, Doomy? How are you doing?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about why you're visiting the Triangle.
Well, I came down here to talk about the book. I got a chance to travel over to University of North Carolina. I don't know if I can say that while I'm here, right? But importantly, also I get a chance to speak here at Duke about the book and talk about education and suburban inequality and really start to get some traction around this issue.
You talk about the fact early in the book that there's a lot of research on the black suburban experience, but generally from an adult perspective, right? Very little research actually examining the experience of young folks. And when we think about suburban schools and the drive towards those schools, right, going back 40 years ago, all these black folks who had the resources, wanting to move out into the suburbs to get their kids into better schools, 40 years later, 2 generations later, right, we're still seeing some of the inequitable educational outcomes.
Absolutely.
Right? And so your book really delves into, in the fictional rolling hills, you know, why are we still looking at an achievement gap? And what should be ostensibly very good schools, right? Why is it still reproducing this inequality? So talk a little bit about, you know, how you go into that.
Well, I start with the idea that we know people often covet middle class status.
Yeah.
And they often talk about moving to the suburbs and getting to a place where there's opportunity. And oftentimes people make choices about where they live based on schools. And when I started to study Rolling Acres, everyone was like, this is a great school district. This is the place you want to put your kids. And then I started to ask some more questions of black parents, and they were like, hold on a second, right? You know, when my kids are at school, they often are one of few in a class.
Right.
When my kids are at school, they're often the first people not to receive the opportunities. They don't get shuffled into advanced placement classes. When my kids are at school, it's their friends that get harassed by the police and the security guard and get suspended. And so I started to think about how the barriers of race continue in the suburbs, right? Even though we've had this push towards middle classness, this push towards suburbanization, we have often assumed that that meant everything was smooth sailing.
Right.
And after you get out there, once you get to many of these schools, while they have celebrated how well they do, they haven't done well with diversity at all. Yeah. In fact, they're willing to say, we have national merit scholars, we have some of the best bands, but by the way, we also have this nagging little thing called the achievement gap.
Well, you talk about the fact there's so much of a focus on school achievement, right? Being able to say the school has great test scores, that the school has this great reputation, that it's almost as if particularly some of the white parents don't want to rock the boat by looking too closely at what's actually happening inside these schools, particularly around diversity.
Absolutely. So one of the things they do is they fixate on this concept of the achievement gap. They say, well, let's talk about the achievement gap. There's some reason that black kids are scoring less well than white kids. And the one thing it can't be is that white folks have influence and advantage, right? Maybe it's something at their homes. Maybe they don't want to learn, right? And it's this false fixation on considering the issue of race, and it's really putting no skin in the game. So I talk about how schools and districts need to really talk about race and power instead of simply saying there's a gap in scores and it's magically appearing.
It's funny, we talked off camera before this, and you know, I mentioned that this book is personal for me at this time because I'm trying to navigate a lot of this with my 12-year-old daughter. And she got an in-school suspension one day, right? And so the director of the school calls. And the first thing he asked me is like, well, is there something going on at home? Right. And I found that to be such an odd way to start the conversation. And part of it is this idea, well, obviously it's not the school, right? That there must be something else at play.
And in fact, educators, I found teachers were quick to say when they had a student who was struggling academically or had a behavioral issue, it was something at home. It couldn't be that I decided to call and pick on Raheem instead of Johnny when he was out of his chair. So there was a lot of rationalizing from teachers and educators that they were doing the work of correcting deficiencies that were at home and in black families, though they knew very little about the black families that were in their classrooms.
Right. You're watching Left to Black. We're here with Professor L. LaRue Lewis-McCoy, author of the new book, Inequality in the Promised Land, Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling, Stanford University Press, 2014. You mentioned resources, right? I mean, that becomes a big part of this. And part of what you say is that when folks think about good schools, they often think about it in terms of material resources, right? They have textbooks, they have Wi-Fi, they have access to the best technology, right? All those things that we think about in very successful suburban schools, you're arguing in part that we really need to think what resources are within the context of a school. There's so many other resources that actually impact how successful black students can be in these educational environments. Talk about some of these resources.
Absolutely. I think that when we look at suburban schools, they may be high performing on average, but there's even gradations there. So one of the examples I talk about in the book is the case of teachers. One of the big ways in which parents try to advocate is to get the best teacher. And they assume they know who's the best, and they often hedge out other families from getting opportunities. So if there's a teacher who has access to science labs, who has sent folks on to high quality training later, it's like, well, let's all rush to get into that classroom. And in one case, in one example that I bring up, what literally happened was a set of white families circulated a petition, demanded a meeting with the principal of a school, and said, make sure my child's not in this class and is in that class, or else we leave. You know, and the sad part is that the petition, someone could look at the petition as great parental organizing, but it was literally monochromatic. There were no black or brown families who even knew about the petition, which means they got a chance to hoard away that opportunity from those families.
And I love that phrase. You use it throughout the book. The idea there are groups of parents that hoard opportunity and hoard resources. And how so much of that actually circulates in these social networks outside of the school, right? So while the school might be integrated, are those social networks where the schools, are they integrated outside? So where are folks getting information in these informal social networks that black and Latino kids have no access to, their families have no access to?
Absolutely. And one of the things that happened when I was doing these interviews was I would sit down with families and I would ask parents, well, who are your children's 5 closest friends, right? And they would name them. And then I would say, well, could you give me the race or ethnicity of their 5 closest friends? And for many of the white families, there was this aha moment, like, wait a minute, maybe I should have named someone different, because it would be, they would all be white after white. And there, in fact, there was one interview that I was doing with a family, and she was talking about having been raised in a segregated society, right, in a segregated community. And she was so excited for her child to be going to school in Rolling Acres, which was so diverse. And in the middle of the interview, she literally broke down into tears, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And she said, you know, basically I realized a lot of the things that I was saying that I had experienced, my son is just reliving, you know. I talk about Rolling Acres as diverse, but the social circles that we roll in, they're based on where we live, and the suburb is segregated. They're based on the sports that we play, which are also segregated, and my friendship networks as an adult are segregated. Right. So that permeates levels far beyond what we often think about, and it has a lot of meaning for information and for opportunity.
You also mentioned that in the context of extracurricular activities, right? On a base level, right? Who actually has the financial resources to engage some extracurricular activities? And yet those extracurricular activities, particularly when there is parental involvement, becomes another kind of social network. You know, there are parents, white parents, that the only time I would interact with them is in some sort of extracurricular, swim meet, you know, ballet or something along those kinds of lines. What does it mean when black and Latino parents, particularly those on the lower economic scale, don't have access to those activities, right? Can't afford the thousands of dollars it may cost to participate in a sport, you know? And that's when those relationships are made, right? This is everything that we know about the professional world, right? You know, outside of the work space, you know, it's the informal conversations at restaurants and bars, and what you're, you know, picked up on is that this actually occurs in terms of educational resources, you know, in suburban schools.
Absolutely, and particularly for families, as you mentioned, on the lower end of the socioeconomic status, they may be able to afford to move to that community, but then the cost of living, all of a sudden the YMCA in the city costs $35. The YMCA in the suburb costs $80.
Right.
And you have to start making these very critical choices about what you can afford to put your child in. You have to deal with a lack of public transportation, and oftentimes these families become further disconnected.
Right.
And so,
and if you actually can get your kids there, the kids are policed.
Absolutely.
Right. in a real way, right, when they're in these spaces. You know, one of the things I also found fascinating about the book, and we're here with Professor Dumi Lewis, as he's known to his friends and colleagues, Associate Professor of Sociology and Black Studies at the City College of New York, talking about his brand new book, Inequality in the Promised Land, Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling. That's Stanford University Press, 2014. Part of this integration piece is really about this idea that we're colorblind, right? And the teachers will tell you time and time again that they're not making distinctions based on the race dynamics of their class, right? That they're functioning in a colorblind kind of way. You highlight on the one part that, colorblind is never colorblind.
Right.
Right. In fact, the absence of recognizing race actually undermines that argument in very significant kind of ways. You also mentioned that when issues of race talk, if you will, come up in these schools, the frame of white adults, either the parents or the teachers, is often what's privileged.
Absolutely. It controls the conversation in so many ways. While you will look at an environment and you'll have Black parents saying race matters, and you'll have children experiencing unequal treatment, it's the frame of the white adults that really governs it. So racism only matters at school when a white teacher can identify someone has done something wrong. If they are unable to see it, it doesn't exist. So, and one of the things I talk about is in classroom interaction. When I was observing teachers, they were very careful to say they called on all students, and they were absolutely right. But when I looked, I realized that Black students received much less feedback.
Right.
So if they provided a wrong answer, in particular, a teacher that I talk about in the book would not correct them. And afterwards he said to me, LaRue, I used to correct my Black students, right? I used to correct them on their grammar, and I would say that it's not standard Middle English, but then I thought my kids are pretty smart, and if I correct them on how they speak English, they may think I don't value their home. Right. So I just let them talk now, and I don't correct them, right? And so it's this huge level of bias and bigotry that is covered over by this massive
and the idea that what needs to be corrected, right? If the information is wrong, right? That you should correct the information, but what he was focused on, or she was focused on correcting, was grammar.
Correct.
Right, and the way that they talked, right, as if there's some sort of deep correlation there.
Exactly, and believing that the best way to do this was to be hands-off, or to make sure that at all costs they were not viewed as racist. In fact, many white adults, their fascination, their fixation was, please don't make me seem racist, right? Instead of talking about, let's see how race operates, how it plays out, how advantage is accumulated, but just make sure as you write this up, I'm not the racist one.
Talk about how white privilege functions in these spaces. This kind of idea that ultimately what the schools are most invested in, right? Even when it's a very diverse school, is protecting the experience of white students, above all.
Yes.
And you mentioned that in the ways that parents would organize around, our kids need to be in this class and what have you. Talk about how that really functions in terms of educational policy, for individual schools or school districts.
Yeah, it's amazing because sometimes we think of privilege as more individualized, but it has a real structural basis. And in Rolling Acres and many suburban districts, the families that are most valued, who are differentially valued, are white families. Right. So they will...
And that's the case often sometimes when there's even Black administrators.
Absolutely, right? So I talk about schools where there are Black principals and Black teachers, and still the prospect of losing white families governs how they act. So one principal said to me that oftentimes these families will threaten exit, these families will threaten going to the district, and she said they treat this public school like it's their private school, right? And so they use their privilege and they cohere it so that they have the opportunities they desire without paying particular attention to how that accumulates disadvantage for other families.
How do you think Black parents can best deal with this kind of dynamic, right? Is there a way for Black parents to organize around that same kind of logic, right, to protect the interests of their children in these schools?
I think there is the chance, there is the space. One of the challenges lies in making sure that you have Black families where they need to be. What I found in Rolling Acres in this particular suburb was that many of the Black families that had more means chose to opt out of the public schools. They were like, this is an everyday battle. Right. And I can't do battle here.
And they send their kids to private school.
Yes, and so they were like, I'd rather worry about what happens in private school and deal with that than to have a constant battle in public school. With that being said, there's a chance for us to have a more collective idea around education, making sure that when we have hypervigilance, because Black parents have always had to watch their kids in school, no matter where you are, right? But as we watch our kids, make sure that we're doing it in collective ways. So I saw some sparks of this, but it wasn't systematic. it ended up being that black parents didn't have a space to organize and come together and challenge things that were happening. But also black parents were locked out of networks of information that were critical to deciding where resources were going.
It's impossible to do this kind of research, and particularly as black scholars, it's almost impossible for us to do work, particularly if it's around culture and society, and not bring our own experiences, you know, both, in this case, both as students and now, you know, as parents. As a new parent, you know, how has your thinking changed? And again, you still have, you know, a youngin'. a
2
real,
months,
real,
right?
real. But how has the fact that you're now this new parent, this new father, you know, impacted how you're thinking about this work going forward?
You know, from the start, literally once I held my daughter for the first time, I was like, okay, now I have the responsibility of stewarding you in a hostile world, right? But also recognizing that if I only control the path of my daughter and I don't influence those who are her friends and the places where she'll be, then I'm failing, right?
Yeah.
So trying to figure out what it is, what are the choices that we can make that are best for her, but also endow the community that we're in with some strength. Because I live in New York City right now, and I live in a neighborhood that's in rapid transition. I will suggest by the time my daughter's in school, it's gonna look very different. It's not gonna look predominantly Latino and African American, right? And she's gonna have to go through these same sets of battles. And I think that we have to be aware of what we're doing, but also pass along collective knowledge and wisdom. Because sometimes folks, we've seen all of these battles in education before, but what we haven't done is communicated and organized to really abate them. We have to make sure we're getting to the core of how we think about black children, their potential, as well as what are the resources we can bring to bear to make sure.
I mean, you mentioned in the book, and what I find just absolutely fascinating is the information gap. You know, what kind of families actually have the leisure time to sit down and go through all the crap that schools send home? I mean, if you're in a working class family and you know, life is like this, right? You gotta get home from work, make a meal, prepare your kids, you know, for homework and what have you, get to the next day. You got to get up early in the morning. Do you really have time to spend an hour and a half, you know, going through your child or your children's book bag to figure out what came home tonight, right?
Yeah, there's a deluge of information that kids get sent, and it was actually intimidating. Like when I started to see how much paperwork was going home, initially I sent information about my study home, and a number of working class families were like, oh yeah, I got all that paper, I get a lot of paper, I don't have time to read that.
It's intimidating for the kids also.
Absolutely, and I've seen schools where they're so intent on getting the announcements home, they staple them to the children, right? So, and I think that when we rely on one form of communication, when we over inundate with information, it disempowers families that could be informed, and it creates greater inequality.
One of the things you also talk about is the way that the educational experience is not cultivated for individual students. You know, in some ways, when you talk about schools wanting to attract the best and the brightest teachers, very often they've been trained to think about students being in certain kinds of, you know, they could almost say, these are the 5 types of students, right? And so I've learned strategies to deal with the 5 types of students. What if your kid is not a kid, you know, that fits into those 5 types of students? And so many of these school districts, you know, are unprepared to deal with that kind of flexibility. And their reaction sometimes is just really to kind of push those kids out, because those kids become a threat to the idea that this is an achieving school.
Right, this is a great school. If your kid is the 6th type, all of a sudden these schools have been dealing with such a narrow slice of people to educate for decades on end. And now as we have more racial minorities in the suburbs, as we have more folks who speak multiple languages, these suburban schools, instead of saying, let's meet the challenge, let's figure out how to educate diversely, sometimes they're actively pushing out, right? And sometimes they're passively pushing out. They're saying your child doesn't conform to the standards. There must be something that's happening at home. What do we need to do, right? I know this is a new environment for you, so how can we help you adjust? Instead of schools themselves shifting their culture. Schools are places that have culture and have structure, but they're malleable. And they should be responsive to who's in their seats.
And you suggested it's under-resourced, it's undervalued, right?
Yes.
Right, in the classroom.
Yeah, you know, I think that we don't think about how culture plays out. Every time you walk into a school building, you can feel that place. When you talk to teachers, you can experience something that is almost intangible, but it matters so much, particularly for diversifying schools. How do you make the environment responsive to who's there, but also keep high standards, right? It's not about saying, I'm considering culture, so there are no standards. Absolutely not. It's really the marriage of the two that make for good schools for all children.
We're here with Professor L. LaRue Lewis-McCoy, who's Associate Professor of Sociology and Black Studies at the City College of New York City, University of New York. He's the author of Inequality in the Promised Land, Stanford University Press. One of the things I also find fascinating about this work, there's very little mention in the book, except in some sort of historical context, of this whole acting white thing, right? And that continues to be the way that mainstream media, right, and even parents, black parents, continue to see the achievement gap, right? It's a lack of value in education amongst black kids and black parents, right? And that the kids are fearful of being acting white. Did you find that was something that was still prevalent amongst the parents and kids at Rolling Hills?
Yeah, in fact, I found parents pulled it out as an explanation, but when I asked them to provide some examples, or when I asked children to talk about their experiences, they were like, that's not what's going on here. And oftentimes when I ask the kids, well, have you ever been called white? I think out of all of the students that I interviewed, one said yes, and he was like, it was by a white student. Right? So and so that tension, that idea of this acting white, that academic achievement is white and I don't want to academically achieve, it's become such a popular myth.
Right.
But we have loads of evidence to suggest that there are things that matter way more than it, right? But it's become a fixation because it also locates black academic failure in the black body.
Yeah.
Right? Schools don't have to be responsive, teachers don't have to be responsive because these kids are self-sabotaging.
The other thing that I find kind of interesting about these schools these days, and I imagine it's prevalent in Rolling Hills also, there seems to be more of an interest for black students to make sure that they follow directions and are obedient, as opposed to really creating black students who are independent and creative thinkers. How does that play out in some place like Rolling Hills?
I think it's important because there's an emphasis on rules and guidelines, right? And anytime black families often did something a little bit different, and by a little bit different I mean bring cupcakes in unannounced, right? It could lead to a cataclysmic outcome, right? Where a parent is asked to leave the school. This emphasis on following rules makes sense when institutions haven't learned how to be dynamic and respond. Because if you have a diversifying student body who have a wide range of experiences, who are thinking about things creatively and differently, and you're not prepared to teach them, of course, you're going to emphasize the rules. You're going to emphasize rote memorization. You're going to emphasize doing whatever you can to keep things in order because it keeps the bubble from expanding. And in fact, we need to take that bubble, expand it, and pop it, right? Yeah. Because what we get from the value of diversity is literally allowing those who have different life experiences to be present and to recenter the dialogue and shape the institution.
We've been joined today by Professor R. LaRue Lewis-McCoy, Associate Professor of Sociology and Black Studies at the City University of New York, the author of the new book, Inequality in the Promised Land, Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling, Stanford University Press, 2014. What's next for you?
Next, I'm doing some work on student activists of color, seeing how they think about social justice. Contemporary. Wow. So think about how they think about social justice, what they do after they leave college, how the activism continues, and the role of the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yeah, well, we look forward to having you back when it comes out.
I look forward to that.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had